They say power can move mountains, but in the cold marble halls of his mansion, the most powerful millionaire in the country felt frozen in time, his soul buried beneath layers of wealth and bitterness. Every tick of the dozen ornate clocks hung motionless on the walls, every gleam of the artificial lights and every echo of silence screamed a dreadful truth. Despite his fortune, he was utterly alone. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're looking at an old photograph or remembering something you lost long ago. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise you, today's story will touch your soul. In the heart of Miami, where gleaming skyscrapers pierce azure skies and palm trees sway in the warm Atlantic breeze, lived a man whose name could make Wall Street tremble with a single phone call. Victor Malone commanded an empire built on real estate investments, cryptocurrency portfolios worth billions, and stock market maneuvers that had made him the wealthiest individual south of Georgia. His net worth exceeded $12 billion, his assets scattered across 5 continents, his business ventures generating profits that flowed like endless rivers of gold. Politicians courted his favor, celebrities begged for his attention, and entire industries depended on his next investment decision. Yet behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Biscayne Bay penthouse, Victor Malone was a ghost haunting his own life. The mansion stretched across 3 acres of prime Miami Beach real estate, its Italian marble floors reflecting emptiness rather than grandeur. Persian rugs worth millions cushioned footsteps that echoed through rooms where laughter had died years ago. Crystal chandeliers cast cold light on oil paintings that had once warmed his heart, now serving as monuments to a happiness that felt like a distant dream. The house smelled of expensive leather, imported wood polish, and the sterile absence of human warmth. Every morning, Victor would wake in his king-sized bed, surrounded by silence so complete it felt like being buried alive. The digital displays of his various investment portfolios glowed on multiple screens throughout his bedroom, showing numbers that climbed steadily upward while his spirit descended into deeper darkness. He owned companies that employed thousands, managed funds that controlled billions in assets, held cryptocurrency wallets with enough Bitcoin to buy small countries. But all this wealth felt like sand slipping through his fingers, meaningless without someone to share it with, worthless without love to give it purpose. The wound that consumed Victor Malone had a precise timestamp. March 15th, 10 years ago, at exactly 3:12 in the afternoon. That was when his world shattered into pieces that no amount of money could reassemble. His wife, Elena, had been driving their 7-year-old daughter Sophia home from ballet practice when armed men intercepted their car near Coral Gables. The attack was swift, brutal, and calculated. Elena suffered traumatic brain injury that left her in a medically induced coma, while Sophia simply vanished, presumably taken by the same criminal organization that had been threatening Victor's business interests for months. The kidnappers belonged to a sophisticated Mafia network that operated throughout South Florida, their tentacles reaching into shipping, construction, and money laundering operations. They demanded not just ransom, but Victor's complete withdrawal from several lucrative real estate developments in their territory. Despite paying millions in Bitcoin and liquidating entire investment portfolios, Victor never saw his daughter again. Elena remained unconscious in a private medical facility, surrounded by the most advanced life support money could buy, her beautiful face peaceful but unreachable behind closed eyelids. From that moment, every clock in Victor's mansion had stopped at 3:12. He couldn't bear to hear time moving forward when his own life had frozen in that instant of loss. The house became a mausoleum of interrupted moments. Elena's coffee cup still sitting on the kitchen counter, Sophia's toys arranged exactly as she had left them, family photographs turned face down because the smiles hurt too much to see. Victor sealed the windows with heavy drapes, blocking out Miami's relentless sunshine that seemed to mock his darkness. His business empire continued to thrive under the management of trusted advisors, his wealth multiplying through automated investments and diversified portfolios that generated passive income in the millions. But success felt hollow when there was no one to celebrate with, no small voice asking about his day, no warm embrace waiting at the end of business meetings. Victor had become a machine for accumulating money, a cold calculator of profit margins and dividend yields, his humanity buried beneath layers of protective cynicism. The neighborhood of Little Havana pulsed with life, just 20 minutes from Victor's sterile mansion, but it might as well have been on another planet. Here, the streets bloomed with hand-painted murals depicting tropical birds and revolutionary heroes, the air thick with the aroma of café cubano and fresh bread from corner bakeries. Salsa music drifted from open windows, mixing with the sounds of children playing dominoes on weathered stoops and elderly men arguing politics under the shade of ancient oak trees. In a modest apartment above a family-owned restaurant, 9-year-old Isabella Rodriguez lived with her mother Maria in 2 small rooms that contained more warmth than Victor's entire mansion. Their home was furnished with second-hand pieces painted bright yellow and turquoise, decorated with religious icons and photographs of 3 generations of family members who had fled Cuba decades earlier. The scent of black beans simmering on the stove mixed with the fragrance of jasmine growing in coffee cans on their tiny balcony. Isabella possessed an otherworldly quality that neighbors noticed from the time she could walk. Her eyes held depths that seemed impossible in someone so young, amber-colored and luminous, as if lit by an inner flame that never dimmed. She had a way of appearing exactly where she was needed most, beside the elderly woman who had fallen on wet sidewalks, near the teenage boy contemplating dangerous choices, next to the mother crying over unpaid bills. People in Little Havana whispered that Isabella could see things others couldn't, that angels followed her through the streets like invisible guardians. Maria Rodriguez worked 16-hour days between 3 different jobs, cleaning office buildings before dawn, serving lunch at a tourist restaurant in South Beach, and taking in sewing work that kept her bent over an ancient machine until midnight. Her hands were rough from industrial cleaning chemicals, her back ached from constant labor, but she never complained within Isabella's hearing. Maria had learned to stretch every dollar until it screamed, to make meals from rice, beans, and whatever vegetables were marked down at the neighborhood market. Despite their poverty, Isabella radiated contentment that puzzled and inspired everyone who met her. She would share her school lunch with children who had forgotten theirs, offer to carry groceries for elderly neighbors, and spend hours reading aloud to Mrs. Gutierrez, whose cataracts had stolen her sight. When Isabella prayed each night, kneeling beside the bed she shared with her mother, her whispered words seemed to fill their small apartment with peace that made their cramped quarters feel like a palace. The intersection of these 2 worlds came on a Tuesday afternoon when restlessness drove Victor from his mansion for the first time in months. He had been pacing his marble floors like a caged animal, surrounded by financial reports showing another record-breaking quarter of profits that meant absolutely nothing to him. His investment portfolio had just passed the $13 billion mark. His real estate holdings were generating rental income in the millions, but the numbers felt like meaningless symbols on screens that might as well have been written in ancient hieroglyphics. Victor's driver had suggested a route through downtown Miami to avoid traffic on the highway, a detour that led them through neighborhoods Victor hadn't seen in years. As their black Mercedes rolled through Little Havana, Victor found himself staring out tinted windows at a world he had forgotten existed. Children played soccer with a makeshift ball in narrow streets. Grandmothers sat on front steps shelling peas and gossiping in rapid Spanish. Teenagers shared earbuds while dancing to music that made the very air seem to shimmer with rhythm and joy. Something about the vibrancy of this community pulled at Victor's chest with an ache he couldn't name. He instructed his driver to stop, then stepped out onto cracked sidewalks that felt foreign beneath his handmade Italian leather shoes. The sounds hit him like a physical force, laughter echoing from every direction, the rapid-fire chatter of multiple conversations in Spanish and English, the melodic call of a fruit vendor advertising mangoes and papayas, the distant rhythm of drums from someone's radio mixing with the closer sound of dominoes clicking on wooden tables. Victor walked slowly through streets he had never noticed, despite living in Miami for 30 years, his expensive suit and cold expression marking him as an obvious outsider in this warm, chaotic neighborhood. He paused in front of a mural depicting the Virgin Mary surrounded by tropical flowers, her painted eyes seeming to follow him with a mixture of compassion and gentle rebuke. The scent of garlic and cumin drifted from a nearby restaurant, reminding him that he hadn't eaten a meal prepared with love since Elena's accident. It was then that he heard the voice, clear and sweet as silver bells carried on the warm afternoon breeze. A child was singing somewhere nearby, words in Spanish that Victor couldn't understand, but that seemed to bypass his mind and speak directly to his wounded heart. The melody was ancient and comforting, the kind of lullaby that mothers had sung to children for thousands of years, carrying within its simple notes all the tenderness and hope that Victor had buried beneath layers of wealth and bitter disappointment. Following the sound around a corner painted with images of dancing couples and flying birds, Victor found himself face to face with Isabella Rodriguez. She sat on the front steps of her building, braiding the hair of a younger girl while singing softly, her amber eyes focused on her task with the kind of gentle concentration that suggested this was sacred work. Her own dark hair caught the afternoon sunlight, creating a halo effect that made Victor's breath catch in his throat with an emotion he couldn't identify. Isabella looked up as his shadow fell across the sidewalk, and when their eyes met, Victor felt something shift inside his chest, like a door that had been sealed shut for years, suddenly creaking open. She didn't flinch from his stern expression or expensive clothes. Instead, she smiled with the kind of warmth that seemed to radiate from her entire being, as natural and unguarded as sunrise after a long night. "I see them too," she said simply, her voice carrying an accent that blended Cuban Spanish with Miami English, each word carefully chosen and delivered with surprising gravity. "The angels who guard the broken." Victor's first instinct was the cynical dismissal that had protected him for a decade. This child was clearly disturbed, probably coached by parents who recognized his wealth and saw an opportunity for exploitation. Angels were fairy tales for the weak-minded, superstitions that disappeared under the harsh light of reality. He had learned that lesson when all his prayers for Elena and Sofia had gone unanswered. When 10 years of bargaining with God had produced nothing but silence and empty rooms. "Angels don't save people like me," Victor replied, his voice carrying the bitter edge that had become his default tone. "Only power does. Only money talks in the real world, little girl. Everything else is just stories people tell themselves to feel better about losing." But Isabella's gaze remained steady and completely unafraid, as if she could see past his expensive armor, straight to the wounded man beneath. Her expression held no judgment, no fear, no calculation, only a kind of infinite patience that reminded Victor uncomfortably of how Elena used to look at him during their worst arguments, when love proved stronger than anger. "Sometimes power wears a blindfold," Isabella said softly, her small hand still gently braiding the younger child's hair without breaking eye contact with Victor. "Sometimes it's the smallest light that shows the way home. My mama says that God hides in places where rich people never think to look because they're too busy counting their treasures to notice the real miracles happening right beside them." Victor felt heat rise in his chest, anger, embarrassment, and something dangerously close to recognition. How dare this child, this nobody from nowhere, presume to lecture him about life? He had built an empire from nothing, had survived losses that would have destroyed weaker men, had accumulated enough wealth to buy and sell entire neighborhoods like this one without noticing the expense on his monthly statements. What could some poverty-stricken girl possibly know about power about the real world, about the kind of pain that money couldn't heal. "You don't know anything about me," Victor said, his voice rising enough to draw curious glances from neighbors sitting on nearby stoops. "You live in a fantasy world where angels fix everything and prayers matter more than profit margins. I live in reality, where money is the only thing that can actually change anything. And even then, sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes the people you love disappear anyway, no matter how much you're willing to pay to bring them back." Isabella nodded gravely, as if Victor had just shared something profound rather than bitter. "My papa disappeared too," she said simply, "when I was 5. Mama cried for a long time and we had to leave our house and come here. But she still talks to him every night. And sometimes I think I see him watching from corners, making sure we're safe. Maybe your people aren't as gone as you think they are. Maybe they're just waiting in a place where money can't reach, but love can." Something in Isabella's words hit Victor like a physical blow, stealing his breath and leaving him speechless on a cracked sidewalk surrounded by the kind of poverty he usually only saw from behind tinted windows. This child had looked at him for 30 seconds and somehow identified the wound he had spent 10 years hiding behind walls of marble and cynicism. She spoke about loss and hope with equal measure, as if both were simply facts of existence rather than the crushing weight that had defined his entire adult life. Victor turned and walked away without another word, his Italian leather shoes clicking against concrete as he fled back to his waiting Mercedes and the safe isolation of his mansion. But as his driver pulled away from the curb, Victor found himself staring back through the rear window at the small figure still sitting on those steps, still braiding hair, still radiating the kind of peace he hadn't felt since Elena's laugh filled their home with music. That night, Victor couldn't sleep. He paced the marble floors of his mansion, past stopped clocks and covered mirrors, past Elena's untouched office and Sophia's preserved bedroom, unable to shake the memory of amber eyes that had seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed defenses. He stood before the sealed windows of his master bedroom, considering for the first time in years what it might feel like to let sunlight enter his carefully controlled environment. Isabella's words echoed in his mind with annoying persistence. Maybe they're just waiting in a place where money can't reach, but love can. It was the kind of sentimental nonsense that Victor had trained himself to dismiss, yet something about the way she had said it, with such quiet conviction and gentle authority, made it impossible to ignore. For the first time in a decade, Victor Malone found himself wondering if his fortress of wealth and cynicism had become a prison that kept out more than pain. The next morning brought news that the criminal organization responsible for his family's tragedy had been making moves throughout South Florida, their influence growing stronger despite law enforcement efforts funded by Victor's own donations to police foundations. His security team reported increased surveillance around his properties, mysterious phone calls to his business associates, and questions being asked about his recent movements. The past was stirring like a sleeping dragon, and even $13 billion couldn't guarantee protection from enemies who had already proven they could reach anything he cared about. Victor sat in his home office, surrounded by monitors displaying real-time updates of his global investment portfolio, cryptocurrency holdings fluctuating by millions of dollars each hour, and stock market positions that required constant attention from his team of financial advisors. The numbers climbed steadily upward, but they felt like abstract concepts rather than actual wealth, meaningless digits in accounts he rarely accessed personally. What good was unlimited money if it couldn't resurrect the dead or heal the broken? What was the point of accumulating more billions when the only purchases that mattered, Elena's consciousness, Sophia's return, his own peace of mind, remained forever beyond reach? Despite his rational mind's insistence that Isabella was simply a disturbed child living in poverty-induced delusion, Victor found himself thinking about her throughout the following days. Her words had planted seeds in soil he thought had been permanently salted, and against his better judgment, those seeds were beginning to sprout with uncomfortable questions. What if there were forms of wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars or digital currencies? What if his empire of assets and investments was actually a monument to his own fear, a wall built to keep out not just pain, but also the possibility of healing? 3 days after their first meeting, Victor instructed his driver to take the same route through Little Havana. He told himself it was simple curiosity, a wealthy man's idle interest in observing how the other half lived. But when they passed the corner where he had encountered Isabella, Victor felt his heartbeat accelerate, and he realized with uncomfortable clarity that he was hoping to see her again. The thought disturbed him. When had he become the type of man who sought comfort from children? When had his loneliness grown so profound that a stranger's words could echo in his mind for days? Isabella was sitting in the same spot, this time reading aloud from a battered book to a group of younger children gathered around her feet like disciples around a teacher. Her voice carried clearly through the open car window, spinning a tale about brave knights and magical kingdoms, her hands gesturing expressively to illustrate each plot twist. The children listened with rapt attention, their faces glowing with the kind of wonder that Victor couldn't remember feeling in decades. Even from inside his air-conditioned Mercedes, Victor could sense the warmth emanating from that small circle of storytelling, the tangible love connecting Isabella to her young audience. This time, Victor didn't get out of the car. Instead, he instructed his driver to park where he could observe without being seen, watching this child who seemed to create magic out of nothing more than attention and kindness. Isabella finished her story with a flourish, then helped the children clean up scattered toys before sending them home with hugs and promises to continue the tale tomorrow. Her movements were graceful and purposeful, each gesture infused with the kind of natural authority that couldn't be taught or purchased. As the other children dispersed, Isabella looked directly at Victor's car, despite its tinted windows and inconspicuous position across the street. She smiled and waved, as if she had known he was there all along, then gathered her book and disappeared into the building where she lived. Victor sat in stunned silence, wondering how a 9-year-old girl had managed to detect his presence when trained security professionals often failed to notice his surveillance, and more importantly, why her acknowledgement had filled him with something dangerously close to hope. Over the following weeks, Victor found himself drawn back to Little Havana with increasing frequency, always maintaining his distance but unable to resist observing Isabella's daily routine. She helped elderly neighbors carry groceries up narrow stairs, played with abandoned dogs until someone adopted them, and sat with crying mothers while their children played nearby. Everywhere Isabella went, small improvements seemed to follow. Arguments ended in laughter, broken toys were mysteriously repaired, and sad faces brightened as if touched by invisible sunlight. Victor began asking discreet questions through his network of private investigators and security personnel. What he learned about Isabella and her mother Maria only deepened the mystery. Maria Rodriguez was exactly what she appeared to be. A hard-working single mother who cleaned offices and served meals to make ends meet, sending every spare dollar to relatives still struggling in Cuba. There were no hidden bank accounts, no suspicious associations, no evidence of any connection to criminal organizations or con artists who might target wealthy marks. Isabella's reputation in the neighborhood was equally straightforward and equally impossible to explain through rational analysis. Neighbors spoke of her with a reverence usually reserved for saints, describing incidents that sounded like miracles, but could always be explained as coincidence if you were determined to maintain skeptical distance. A terminally ill dog that recovered after Isabella spent an afternoon reading to it. A failing family business that suddenly received an unexpected loan from an anonymous benefactor the day after Isabella mentioned their struggles. An abusive husband who left town quietly after Isabella asked him politely why he made his wife cry so much. Victor's rational mind cataloged each story as the product of wishful thinking and selective memory, the way desperate people found patterns in random events to create meaning from chaos. But his heart, that organ he had thought permanently damaged beyond repair, began to beat with something that felt suspiciously like curiosity mixed with longing. What would it feel like to believe in miracles again? What would it cost him to consider the possibility that power came in forms his Harvard MBA had never taught him to recognize? The question became more than academic when Victor's security team reported escalating threats from the same criminal organization that had destroyed his family. Anonymous calls warned that his recent activities, the unusual trips through Little Havana, the questions about certain residents, the increased presence in neighborhoods where he had no obvious business interests, had attracted unwanted attention. Old enemies were stirring, and they interpreted his behavior changes as signs that the grief-stricken recluse might be emerging from his self-imposed isolation with revenge on his mind. Victor realized with growing dread that his interest in Isabella might have inadvertently painted a target on an innocent child's back. The same monsters who had taken Elena and Sophia could easily reach anyone in Little Havana, and a 9-year-old girl who had no understanding of the dangers that money and power could attract would be helpless against professionals who made their living through violence and intimidation. The thought of Isabella suffering because of his selfish curiosity filled Victor with a fear more acute than any he had experienced since receiving that first ransom demand 10 years earlier. But alongside fear came something Victor hadn't felt in a decade, the fierce desire to protect someone other than himself. Isabella had awakened something in him that went beyond cynical self-interest, something that made the thought of her harm feel like a physical wound. For the first time since Elena's accident, Victor found himself caring about another person's welfare more than his own safety, and the intensity of that emotion caught him completely off guard. Standing in his office surrounded by screens displaying his vast financial empire, Victor made a decision that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Instead of retreating further into isolated safety, instead of hiring additional security and building higher walls around his mansion, he was going to take the most dangerous risk of his adult life. He was going to trust a 9-year-old girl with his deepest secrets and ask her to help him with something that all his billions had been unable to accomplish. Victor was going to ask Isabella Rodriguez if she really could see angels, and if those angels might be willing to help a man who had long ago stopped believing in anything beyond the cold mathematics of profit and loss. It was either the most foolish decision he had ever made or the first step toward salvation he hadn't even realized he needed. Either way, it was too late to turn back now. The wall around his heart had developed its first crack, and everything was about to change. The approaching storm clouds gathering over Biscayne Bay seemed to mirror the turmoil building in Victor's carefully ordered world, and somewhere in Little Havana, a small girl with amber eyes continued her daily routine of creating small miracles, completely unaware that her life was about to intersect with forces that would test the very limits of her otherworldly gift. Victor Malone's decision to reach out to Isabella Rodriguez required more courage than any business deal he had ever negotiated, more vulnerability than he had shown since childhood. For 3 days, he sat in his study, crafting and discarding messages that might convince Maria Rodriguez to allow her daughter to visit his mansion without sounding like the ravings of a disturbed man. How did one explain to a struggling single mother that her 9-year-old daughter possessed something that $13 billion couldn't buy? How did one request help from a child without appearing predatory or insane? Finally, Victor chose the simplest approach: complete honesty. He handwrote a letter on expensive stationery, his normally steady penmanship shaking slightly as he explained his situation. He wrote about Elena lying unconscious in a private medical facility, about Sophia's disappearance that haunted his every waking moment, about the criminal organization that had stolen his family and was now threatening to finish what they had started. He wrote about his vast wealth that felt meaningless in the face of loss, about the isolation that money couldn't cure, and about the strange sense of hope that Isabella had awakened in him during their brief encounter. The letter Victor finally sent was neither a business proposition nor a plea for charity, but something he hadn't written in years, an honest human communication from one struggling soul to another. He included no mention of payment or reward, made no promises of financial assistance. offered nothing except his genuine need for whatever gift Isabella possessed and his solemn oath to protect her from any danger his request might create. He asked Maria to meet him at a public location of her choosing, where she could evaluate his sincerity and decide for herself whether to trust him with her most precious treasure. Maria Rodriguez read Victor's letter 3 times before believing what she was seeing. The handwriting was elegant and obviously educated. The paper was expensive enough to pay her rent for a month, and the return address was in an area of Miami Beach where people like her family never went except to clean houses or serve meals. But the words themselves carried a desperate sincerity that reminded Maria of her own prayers during the darkest days after Isabella's father had disappeared. The kind of raw honesty that came only from souls tested beyond their breaking point. Isabella found her mother sitting at their small kitchen table at midnight, the letter spread before her like a map to an unknown country. When Maria tried to explain that a very wealthy man wanted to meet with them, Isabella nodded gravely, as if she had been expecting this news for some time. "The sad man with the broken family," she said simply. "I've been praying for him since we met. He needs help reaching the place where love lives, but he's forgotten the way." Maria's skepticism warred with her daughter's supernatural certainty and with their very practical need for whatever assistance a billionaire might provide. Their rent was 3 months behind, their car had been repossessed 2 weeks earlier, and Maria's job at the restaurant was threatened by the owner's declining profits. If this wealthy stranger was dangerous, they were already living in danger every day. If he was genuine, Isabella's gift might finally serve a purpose greater than comforting neighbors who had nothing material to offer in return. The meeting Victor had requested took place at a small cafe in Coconut Grove, neutral territory where both parties could feel relatively safe while evaluating each other's intentions. Victor arrived first, choosing a corner table where he could observe the entire restaurant while remaining partially hidden behind a pillar. He hadn't eaten in a public place in over 2 years, and the simple act of sitting among strangers felt like exposing himself to sniper fire. When Maria and Isabella entered the cafe, Victor's breath caught in his throat. Under fluorescent lighting, Isabella's otherworldly quality was even more apparent than it had been on sunny street corners. She moved with the kind of ethereal grace that belonged in religious paintings, her amber eyes scanning the room with ancient wisdom, before settling on Victor's hiding place with unerring accuracy. She smiled and waved, exactly as she had from her front steps, then tugged her mother's hand in his direction. Maria Rodriguez was younger than Victor had expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of worn beauty that comes from years of hard work and constant worry. Her handshake was firm but brief, her dark eyes evaluating Victor with the sharp intelligence of someone who had learned to spot trouble before it could hurt her family. She wore her best dress, a simple blue outfit that had been carefully mended and pressed, and carried herself with dignity that no amount of wealth could purchase. "You're the man who watches Isabella from his car," Maria said without preamble, settling into the chair across from Victor while keeping her daughter close beside her. "My neighbors notice expensive cars. We notice when they come back day after day. So tell me, Mr. Malone, what does a man with your kind of money want with my little girl?" Victor had prepared speeches about business partnerships and consulting arrangements, elaborate explanations that would make his request sound rational and professional. But faced with Maria's direct gaze and Isabella's serene presence, he found himself telling the truth with a simplicity that surprised him. He spoke about the loneliness that had consumed him since Elena's accident, about the guilt that ate at him every day because his wealth hadn't been enough to protect the people he loved most, and about the strange sense of peace Isabella had somehow created in him during their brief conversation. "I dream about my wife every night," Victor admitted, his voice barely audible above the cafe's ambient noise. "She's trying to tell me something, but I can never understand what she's saying. And Sophia, my daughter, I see her in every child's face, but I can never quite remember what her laugh sounded like. I have enough money to buy anything in this world except peace, except forgiveness, except hope. Your daughter has something I lost, something I need if I'm going to survive what's coming. Isabella listened to Victor's confession with the kind of focused attention that adults rarely gave each other, let alone children giving to grown-ups. When he finished speaking, she reached across the table and placed her small hand over his much larger one, the gesture so natural and comforting that Victor felt tears threaten for the first time in years. "The angels say your family isn't lost," Isabella said softly, her young voice carrying absolute conviction. "They're trapped in a place where angry hearts can't reach them. But your anger is like a big wall keeping everyone apart, even the people who love you. If you want to find them again, you have to let the wall fall down. It's scary to do that. But love is stronger than scared feelings." Maria watched this exchange with the protective instincts of a mother who had spent 9 years learning to interpret her daughter's unusual gifts. Isabella had always been different, had always known things she shouldn't know, and seen things that weren't visible to ordinary eyes. Neighbors brought their troubles to her as if she were a tiny priest, and somehow their problems always seemed to resolve themselves after Isabella had listened and offered her strange, wise counsel. But this was different. This man represented a world that could destroy them without thinking, the kind of power that crushed people like Maria's family when they got in its way. Yet something in Victor's broken confession rang true to Maria's own experience of loss and desperation. She recognized the particular hell of loving someone you couldn't protect, of carrying guilt that no amount of effort could wash away. "If Isabella helps you," Maria said carefully, "what happens when those people who hurt your family decide they want to hurt her too? You say you'll protect her, but you couldn't protect your own wife and daughter. What makes you think you can keep my child safe from the same monsters?" Victor met Maria's challenging gaze directly, and when he answered, his voice carried the iron certainty that had built his business empire. "Because this time I'll do whatever it takes. This time I won't play by rules that let evil win. I've spent 10 years following laws that didn't protect Elena and Sophia, trying to fight devils with lawyers and police reports. If someone threatens Isabella, I'll become the monster they should have feared the first time." The promise hung in the air between them, stark and violent and completely sincere. Maria saw something in Victor's eyes that convinced her he meant every word, and for the first time since reading his letter, she began to believe that this strange alliance might actually serve her daughter's mysterious purpose rather than exploit it. Isabella squeezed Victor's hand gently, drawing his attention back to her luminous gaze. "The angry feelings inside you are hurting your heart," she said with the gravity of someone much older. "But anger can be like fire. It burns everything bad, but it also burns everything good if you're not careful. Maybe God gave you all that money so you could learn how to use it like medicine instead of like a weapon. Maybe helping other people is how you help yourself." Over the following hour, an unlikely partnership began to form around that small cafe table. Victor explained the extent of the criminal threats facing him, the sophisticated network of corruption that had already claimed 2 lives and showed no signs of losing interest in finishing what they had started. Maria shared the daily struggles of their life in Little Havana, the constant worry about rent and food and Isabella's future, in a world that rarely rewarded goodness without power to protect it. Isabella listened to both adults with the patient attention of someone accustomed to hearing people's deepest fears, occasionally offering observations that seemed to come from a wisdom far beyond her 9 years. She spoke about forgiveness as if it were a practical skill rather than abstract concept, about love as a force that could be directed and amplified through conscious choice, about faith as something that grew stronger when it was shared rather than hoarded in private. When they finally left the cafe, Victor felt lighter than he had in years, as if some invisible burden had been lifted from his shoulders. For the first time since Elena's accident, he had told his complete truth to another human being and been met with understanding rather than pity or judgment. Isabella and Maria had agreed to visit his mansion the following weekend, not as his employees or charity cases, but as partners in something none of them fully understood, but all of them desperately needed. As Victor's driver took them back to Little Havana, Isabella pressed her face against the car window and waved goodbye to Maria, who stood watching from the cafe's entrance until they disappeared around a corner. The child's enthusiasm was infectious, and Victor found himself almost smiling as she chattered about all the things she wanted to show him, all the stories she wanted to tell, all the prayers she wanted to teach him. "You know what I think?" Isabella said, settling back into the leather seat with the satisfaction of someone who had just completed important work. "I think your angels have been waiting for you to ask for help. They were probably getting really tired of watching you be sad all by yourself. Angels like to fix things, but they're very polite. They won't help unless you invite them. Now that you've invited them, everything's going to start changing." Victor looked down at this extraordinary child who spoke about angels as casually as other children discuss toys or television shows. And for the first time in a decade, he allowed himself to hope that she might be right. Change was coming whether he was ready for it or not, and perhaps it was finally time to stop running from the possibility that some wounds could actually heal, that some losses could be transformed into gifts, that even broken hearts could learn to beat again with renewed purpose. The war for Victor Malone's soul was about to begin, and his unexpected allies were a hard-working single mother who had learned to trust her daughter's impossible gift, and a 9-year-old girl who saw angels in the spaces where cynicism told him only emptiness lived. Against the sophisticated criminal network that had already destroyed his family once, it seemed like the most uneven battle imaginable. But as Isabella had said, sometimes the smallest light could show the way home, and Victor was finally ready to start believing in miracles again. Isabella's first visit to Victor's mansion was scheduled for the following Saturday, but the days between their cafe meeting and her arrival felt to Victor like the longest week of his life. He found himself preparing for her visit with the kind of nervous energy he hadn't felt since his first major business presentation decades earlier. Except this time, the stakes felt immeasurably higher than any financial deal he had ever negotiated. Victor spent hours walking through his house, seeing it through the eyes of a child who lived in 2 rooms above a restaurant. The marble floors that had once seemed elegant now felt cold and unwelcoming. The crystal chandeliers cast harsh light that revealed the absence of warmth rather than creating luxury. The stopped clocks positioned throughout every room suddenly seemed less like monuments to grief and more like symptoms of a life that had forgotten how to move forward. For the first time in 10 years, Victor opened some of the sealed windows, allowing Miami's warm winter sunshine to stream through glass that had been professionally cleaned but never illuminated the spaces beyond. The light revealed dust patterns and faded zones that spoke of a house where beauty had been preserved, but life had been forgotten. The fresh air carried scents of jasmine and salt water that awakened memories of happier times, when Elena had insisted on keeping flowers throughout their home, and Sophia had run through these same hallways with laughter echoing behind her like music. Victor's security team worked overtime that week, conducting sweeps for surveillance devices, updating recognition software for facial identification systems, and coordinating with local law enforcement contacts who could be trusted to maintain discretion while providing additional protection. The threat level remained elevated according to their intelligence sources, with increased chatter among criminal networks suggesting that Victor's recent behavioral changes had not gone unnoticed by his old enemies. But alongside the security preparations, Victor found himself making changes he couldn't entirely explain or justify. He instructed his housekeeping staff to remove the dust covers from furniture in rooms that had been closed since Elena's accident. He had fresh flowers delivered and placed throughout the house, their bright colors and sweet fragrances creating an atmosphere of life that felt almost foreign after years of sterile preservation. Most significantly, he had the grandfather clock in the main hallway wound and set to the correct time, its steady ticking providing a soundtrack of forward motion that made his heart race with something between anxiety and anticipation. Isabella arrived that Saturday morning accompanied by her mother, both of them traveling in Victor's armored Mercedes with a security detail that maintained discreet distance while ensuring their safety. Maria wore the same careful dignity she had displayed at the cafe, but Victor could see the way her eyes widened as they passed through the mansion's security gates and approached the imposing Italian villa that had been his prison for the past decade. Isabella, however, showed no intimidation or surprise at the mansion's grandeur. She walked through the enormous front doors as if entering a familiar space, her amber eyes taking in details with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was seeing more than just expensive furniture and architectural details. She moved through Victor's carefully curated museum of wealth and loss like a small detective gathering evidence, occasionally pausing to touch surfaces or stare at paintings with expressions that seemed to contain entire conversations Victor couldn't hear. "The house is very sad," Isabella announced after completing her initial survey, settling into one of Elena's favorite chairs as if she had been invited specifically for that purpose. "All the prettiness can't hide how lonely everything feels. It's like wearing fancy clothes to a funeral. You might look nice, but you're still sad about the person who's gone." Victor felt the accuracy of her observation like a physical blow. This mansion had indeed become a mausoleum, a place where beauty served death rather than life, where every luxury item had been transformed into evidence of loss rather than blessing. The wealth that had once represented freedom and security now felt like elaborate chains binding him to a past that he couldn't release, but couldn't bear to inhabit. Maria sat quietly in a corner, watching her daughter interact with this wounded billionaire, ready to intervene if Isabella's unusual directness crossed lines that might endanger them both. But Victor seemed to welcome Isabella's honesty, even when it cut straight to the heart of his carefully protected wounds. He listened to her observations with the desperate attention of someone who had been waiting years for anyone to see past his defenses and acknowledge the pain he carried. "Tell me about the angels," Victor said, settling into a chair near Isabella's, his voice carrying none of the skepticism that had marked their first encounter. "What do they look like? How do they talk to you? What did they say about me?" Isabella considered his questions with the seriousness of someone being asked to explain advanced mathematics rather than supernatural phenomena. "Angels don't always look the same," she began, her young voice taking on the rhythm of a natural storyteller. "Sometimes they look like regular people, except they have this light around them that makes you feel warm inside. Sometimes they're just feelings that come to you when you really need to know what to do. And sometimes they talk through other people's voices, using words that person wouldn't normally say." She paused, studying Victor's face with those impossibly wise amber eyes. "The angels that watch you are very old and very patient. They've been trying to help you for a long time, but you kept pushing them away because you were too angry to listen. They're not mad at you for being angry. They understand why you feel that way. But they want you to know that anger is like carrying heavy rocks in your pockets. It might make you feel stronger, but it also makes it harder to walk where you need to go." Victor found himself hanging on every word, searching Isabella's expression for any sign of deception or manipulation, but finding only sincerity so complete it felt almost sacred. "What do they want me to do?" he asked, surprised by the vulnerability in his own voice. "How do I fix what's broken? How do I find Elena and Sophia again?" Isabella's answer came without hesitation, as if she had been waiting for exactly this question. "They want you to remember that love is bigger than death, bigger than angry people, bigger than money or power or any of the things that scare you. But remembering love isn't something you can do with just your thinking mind. You have to practice it with your actions. You have to help other people so that love can grow strong enough to reach the places where your family is waiting." Over the following hours, Isabella moved through Victor's mansion like a tiny priest performing exorcism through compassion rather than ritual. She listened to his stories about Elena and Sophia with absolute attention, occasionally asking questions that helped him remember details he had forgotten or feared to revisit. She examined photographs with the careful respect of someone handling holy relics, commenting on the happiness visible in past moments while acknowledging the reality of present loss. Most remarkably, Isabella seemed completely unimpressed by the material wealth surrounding them. She showed no interest in Victor's art collection, asked no questions about the value of obvious luxury items, and made no requests for anything beyond the simple snack Maria had packed for their visit. Her focus remained entirely on Victor's emotional state, as if she could see straight through $13 billion to the wounded soul beneath. "Money can't hug you," Isabella observed during lunch, which they ate in Victor's formal dining room at a table designed to seat 20 guests. "And it can't tell you jokes or sing you lullabies when you're scared. That's why rich people are sometimes the loneliest people. They have everything except the things that matter most. But loneliness isn't a punishment. It's just a feeling telling you that your heart needs different food than your body." As the afternoon progressed, something subtle but profound began shifting in Victor's carefully controlled environment. The house felt warmer, despite unchanged thermostat settings. The light entering through opened windows seemed softer and more golden. The steady tick of the restored grandfather clock provided a comforting rhythm that made the mansion feel more like a home than a museum. Even Maria began to relax, accepting Victor's invitation to explore the extensive library and commenting appreciatively on Elena's collection of Spanish literature. But the day's most significant moment came when Isabella asked to see the room where Victor's family had lived their daily life. He led her to the master bedroom suite, where Elena's clothes still hung in the closet and Sophia's drawings still decorated the refrigerator in their small family kitchen. Isabella moved through these spaces with reverent attention, touching surfaces and examining details with the focus of someone reading an important message. Standing beside the bed where Elena had slept beside him for 15 years, Isabella placed her small hand on Victor's arm and said words that stopped his breath entirely. "She's not as far away as you think. She's been trying to visit you in your dreams, but sadness makes the dreams fuzzy. She wants you to know that forgiveness is the bridge that connects this world to wherever she is now. Not forgiving the bad people who hurt her. That's their problem to fix. Forgiving yourself for not being able to save her. That's what's keeping the dreams fuzzy." Victor felt his knees weaken as 10 years of suppressed grief finally found its voice. For the first time since Elena's accident, he allowed himself to cry, not the bitter tears of rage he had shed alone in dark rooms, but the healing tears of loss acknowledged and love remembered. Isabella stood beside him without judgment or embarrassment, her small presence providing anchor points for emotional storms that might otherwise have swept him away entirely. When his tears finally subsided, Victor found that something fundamental had shifted inside his chest. The granite weight of guilt that had pressed against his heart for a decade felt lighter, not because his loss was any less real, but because the love underneath had finally been allowed to breathe again. Elena and Sophia were still gone, still beyond his reach, but for the first time he could remember them with gratitude rather than despair. "Thank you," Victor whispered to Isabella, his voice rough with emotion but clearer than it had been in years. "I don't understand how you do what you do, but I know you've given me something I thought was gone forever. How do I repay a gift like that?" Isabella's answer was immediate and practical, delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating obvious truth. "You help other people find their way back to love too. You use your money power to be like an angel for families who need protecting but don't have the resources to protect themselves. You become what you needed someone to be for you when your heart was breaking." As Maria and Isabella prepared to leave that evening, Victor felt a familiar dread at the prospect of returning to solitude. But this time, the loneliness felt different, not like punishment, but like preparation. A quiet space where he could process what had been awakened and plan how to honor the gift he had been given. Isabella had planted seeds in soil that had been barren for too long, and Victor found himself genuinely curious about what would grow. "Will you come back?" he asked as they reached the front door, unable to hide the hope in his voice. Will you help me learn how to use my resources the way the angels want me to?" Isabella's smile contained the warmth of 1,000 candles. "The angels aren't finished with you yet," she said with complete confidence, "and neither am I. But next time, you have to promise to let more light into this house. Angels like bright places where they can dance without bumping into sadness." As Victor watched their car disappear through his security gates, he realized that for the first time in 10 years, he was looking forward to tomorrow rather than dreading another day of empty routine. The transformation Isabella had begun in him felt as mysterious and powerful as any business deal he had ever negotiated, except this time the profit would be measured in restored hope rather than accumulated wealth. Standing alone in his mansion's grand foyer, Victor made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of transforming his fortress of isolation into something that could serve life rather than preserving death. Tomorrow, he would start becoming the man Isabella's angels apparently believed he could be. But tonight, for the first time in a decade, he would sleep without the weight of accumulated guilt pressing against his chest. And maybe, just maybe, Elena would finally be able to reach him in his dreams. The grandfather clock in the hallway continued its steady rhythm, marking time that moved forward rather than remaining frozen in moments of loss, and throughout the mansion, opened windows let in the warm Miami night with all its possibilities for redemption and renewal. Over the following weeks, Isabella's influence on Victor's life became apparent in ways both subtle and dramatic. Their visits settled into a routine that felt as natural as it was unprecedented. Every Tuesday and Saturday afternoon, Maria would accompany her daughter to the mansion, where Isabella would spend hours helping Victor sort through the emotional wreckage of his past, while simultaneously guiding him toward a future that served purposes larger than his own survival. Isabella's methods defied conventional understanding, but produced undeniable results. She would sit with Victor in Elena's garden, now being restored to its former beauty by professional landscapers, and ask him to tell stories about his wife and daughter that emphasized joy rather than loss. She taught him simple prayers that felt more like conversations with beloved friends than desperate pleas for divine intervention. Most remarkably, she helped him understand that wealth could be transformed from a shield against pain into a tool for healing others' wounds. "God gave you all that money for a reason," Isabella explained during one of their garden conversations, her small hands busy helping Victor plant new roses while she delivered wisdom that seemed to come from ancient sources. "But maybe the reason isn't to make you happy. Maybe it's to make other people happy, and you get to be happy by watching that happen. Like, when you share your lunch with someone who's hungry, you don't have less lunch. You have more good feelings." Under Isabella's influence, Victor began reaching out to families who had suffered losses similar to his own. He established a foundation dedicated to supporting victims of violent crime, providing resources for medical care, legal assistance, and psychological counseling that many families couldn't otherwise afford. The foundation was funded entirely from his personal fortune, managed by professionals who shared his newly awakened commitment to serving others rather than accumulating more wealth for his already excessive holdings. Each family the foundation helped provided Victor with opportunities to practice the kind of compassionate engagement that Isabella had modeled for him. He learned to listen to stories of loss without trying to fix them through financial solutions alone, to offer comfort that acknowledged pain rather than trying to minimize it, and to find hope in small improvements rather than demanding complete restoration of what had been taken. The work was emotionally demanding in ways that business negotiations had never been, requiring Victor to maintain openness to others' pain while protecting his own still fragile healing. But Isabella seemed to understand exactly how much growth he could handle and provided guidance that helped him expand his capacity for compassion without being overwhelmed by the magnitude of suffering in the world. "When you help sad people," Isabella observed during one of their regular conversations, "you help the sad parts inside yourself too. It's like when you water flowers in a garden. All the flowers get stronger, not just the ones you're paying attention to. Your Elena and Sophia flowers are getting stronger too, even though you can't see them growing yet. Most evenings after Isabella's visits, Victor would find himself able to sleep more peacefully than he had in years. His dreams, once haunted by nightmares of loss and failure, began featuring gentler visions that felt like communications rather than torments. He would dream of Elena smiling in sunlit gardens, of Sophia playing with other children whose laughter created music that lingered after waking. These dreams felt different from the desperate fantasies that had once tortured him. They carried comfort rather than pain, hope rather than regret. But alongside the profound healing Isabella was facilitating, darker clouds continued gathering on the horizon. Victor's security team reported increased surveillance around his properties, more sophisticated attempts to gather information about his daily routines, and intelligence suggesting that the criminal organization responsible for his family's tragedy was planning some kind of significant action. The threats had evolved beyond simple intimidation into something that felt like preparation for direct confrontation. The criminals seemed particularly interested in Victor's new routine, his regular visitors, and his unusual friendship with a family from Little Havana. Security cameras captured unmarked vehicles conducting surveillance on Maria and Isabella's apartment building, mysterious inquiries made by strangers asking neighbors about the little girl who spent time with wealthy benefactors. The pattern suggested that Victor's enemies had identified his newfound source of hope and were preparing to attack it. Maria began noticing the signs of danger even without being briefed by Victor's security professionals. Strange cars parked on their street for too long, unfamiliar faces appearing at the restaurant where she worked, questions asked by customers who showed more interest in her family situation than their meals. Her maternal instincts, sharpened by years of protecting Isabella in an often hostile world, recognized the approach of predators even when they remained in shadows. One evening after Isabella had fallen asleep, Maria confronted Victor with concerns she could no longer keep to herself. They sat in his study, surrounded by monitors displaying his financial empire and security camera feeds showing the peaceful exterior of his well-protected mansion. But the contrast between his safety and her family's vulnerability had never felt more stark. "They know about us now," Maria said quietly, her voice carrying the controlled fear of someone who had learned to function despite constant anxiety. "Isabella is in danger because she's helping you, and you can't protect her the way you can protect yourself. Maybe it's time for us to disappear for a while, go somewhere your enemies can't reach us." Victor's first instinct was to offer more security, better protection, unlimited resources to keep Isabella and Maria safe while maintaining the relationship that had become the foundation of his healing. But as he looked at Maria's tired face and considered the sophisticated nature of the threats they were facing, he realized that his money and power might not be sufficient to guarantee Isabella's safety. The same criminals who had successfully attacked his family despite every conceivable precaution were now targeting a 9-year-old girl whose only crime had been showing kindness to a broken man. "I can't lose her," Victor admitted, his voice breaking with emotion that surprised them both. "I know that sounds selfish, and maybe it is, but Isabella has given me back something I thought was gone forever. Without her, I'll go back to being the man who was slowly dying in this empty house, and I'm not sure I'm strong enough to survive that kind of darkness again." Maria studied Victor's face and saw something that reminded her powerfully of her own desperation during the worst days after Isabella's father had disappeared. This was the look of someone who had found hope after years of despair and would do anything to protect it, even if that meant making decisions that weren't entirely rational or safe. "Then maybe," Maria said slowly, "we need to find a different way to fight back. You have money and power, but Isabella has something else, something that scared bad people have always been afraid of. Maybe instead of running away or hiding, we find a way to use all our gifts together to end this threat permanently." Isabella, despite appearing to sleep peacefully in Victor's guest room, had been listening to this conversation with the kind of focused attention she gave to every important discussion about her unusual role in the world. When her mother and Victor had finished talking, she appeared in the study doorway wearing Elena's old robe that had been found in a closet and somehow fit her small frame perfectly. "The angels have been waiting for you two to figure this out," Isabella said with the satisfaction of someone whose patience had finally been rewarded. "They've been showing me pictures in my dreams about what needs to happen next, but it's going to require you to trust them completely, even when what they want doesn't make sense to your grown-up thinking." Victor and Maria exchanged glances that contained entire conversations about the impossibility of their situation, the inadequacy of conventional solutions, and their growing willingness to trust a 9-year-old girl whose wisdom seemed to come from sources beyond normal human understanding. "What do the angels want us to do?" Victor asked, his voice containing none of the skepticism that had characterized his early interactions with Isabella. After weeks of witnessing her impossible insights and gentle miracles, he had learned to take her spiritual communications as seriously as any intelligence briefing from his security team. Isabella's answer would change everything, though none of them could have imagined the full implications of what she was about to propose. The little girl who saw angels was about to ask them to have faith in a plan that would require Victor to risk everything he had left to lose, and Maria to trust her daughter's life to forces that operated beyond the reach of money, power, or conventional protection. But as Isabella began explaining what the angels had shown her in dreams filled with light and possibility, both adults found themselves beginning to believe that sometimes the most impossible solutions were the only ones powerful enough to heal wounds that had seemed beyond any earthly remedy. Isabella's plan, as she explained it to Victor and Maria in the quiet sanctuary of his study, was both breathtakingly simple and terrifyingly complex. The angels had shown her that the criminal organization threatening their safety drew its power from darkness, not metaphorical darkness, but actual shadows where evil could hide and grow stronger. To defeat them permanently, Isabella would need to bring so much light into their world that the shadows would have nowhere left to retreat. "Light isn't just something you can see," Isabella explained, settling into Elena's favorite reading chair as if it had been waiting for her all along. "It's also goodness and truth and love all mixed together. Bad people can handle a little bit of light, but when there's too much light all at once, they have to change or run away. We're going to make so much light that they won't be able to stay bad anymore." The practical implementation of this mystical strategy, as Isabella outlined it, would require Victor to do something that violated every principle of personal safety his security team had ever recommended. He would need to make himself completely vulnerable to his enemies, creating an opportunity for them to attack while simultaneously exposing their evil intentions to the full scrutiny of law enforcement, media attention, and public awareness. Victor would announce the establishment of his Victim Support Foundation at a public ceremony, deliberately choosing a location and format that would be impossible for his security team to completely protect. The announcement would include specific details about his family's tragedy, his years of isolation and grief, and his recent transformation through the unlikely friendship with a 9-year-old girl from Little Havana. He would make Isabella's role in his healing so publicly visible that attacking her would require the criminals to reveal themselves in ways that would destroy their ability to operate in shadows. "But what if they hurt you instead of me?" Victor asked, his voice tight with concern for Isabella's safety, despite her reassurances about angelic protection. "What if making myself a target doesn't protect you, but just gives them more people to hurt?" Isabella's response carried the kind of absolute certainty that comes only from complete faith. "The angels showed me that bad people are most dangerous when good people are afraid of them. But when good people stop being afraid and start shining their light as bright as they can, the angels can work through them to fix things that seemed impossible to fix. You can't protect me by hiding. You can only protect me by becoming so full of light that darkness can't get close to either of us." Maria's motherly instincts rebelled against any plan that required her daughter to be used as bait in a trap designed to catch sophisticated criminals. But as she watched Isabella explain her vision with the calm authority of someone who had been having conversations with divine messengers for years, Maria found her protective fears being overwhelmed by something larger and more powerful, her growing recognition that Isabella had been born for exactly this purpose. "How do we know the angels are right?" Maria asked quietly. "How do we know this isn't just a 9-year-old girl's fantasy about fixing things that are too big and dangerous for any child to handle?" Isabella's answer came without hesitation, delivered with the patient tone of someone explaining obvious truth to adults who had forgotten how to see clearly. "Because the angels never lie, and they never ask you to do things that hurt innocent people. They're asking us to trust love instead of fear, to choose hope instead of hiding, and to believe that good things are stronger than bad things when enough people work together. That's not fantasy. That's how the world is supposed to work." Over the following days, Victor found himself torn between rational caution and unprecedented hope. Every security expert he consulted warned that Isabella's plan would create unacceptable risks, not just for his own safety, but for anyone associated with his public foundation announcement. His lawyers expressed concern about the legal implications of involving a minor child in what amounted to a law enforcement operation without proper authorization or protection protocols. But when Victor looked at Isabella during their regular garden conversations, when he watched her pray with such complete confidence and joy, when he saw the miraculous changes her presence had created in his previously lifeless mansion, he found his doubts being overwhelmed by growing faith in possibilities that transcended rational calculation. Perhaps there were forms of protection that couldn't be measured in dollars or security personnel. Perhaps some battles could only be won through spiritual weapons his Harvard MBA had never taught him to recognize. The decision was ultimately made not through careful analysis, but through a moment of pure emotional clarity that occurred during one of Isabella's visits. They were sitting in Elena's restored garden, watching sunset paint the Miami sky in shades of gold and coral, when Isabella asked Victor a question that cut straight to the heart of his dilemma. "If Elena and Sophia were watching you right now," Isabella said softly, "what would they want you to choose? Being safe but staying scared, or being brave and helping other families so they don't have to hurt the way you've been hurting?" Victor closed his eyes and tried to imagine his wife and daughter observing this conversation from whatever realm they now inhabit. Elena had always chosen courage over comfort, had always insisted that their wealth carried responsibilities to help others rather than just protecting themselves. Sophia had possessed the kind of fearless compassion that would have loved Isabella instantly, would have wanted to help other children who were facing dangers they were too small to handle alone. "They would tell me to trust you," Victor said, opening his eyes to find Isabella smiling with the satisfaction of someone whose patience had finally been rewarded. "They would tell me that some risks are worth taking, especially when the alternative is letting other families suffer what we suffered. They would tell me to have faith in angels, even when I can't see them myself." Maria made her own decision that same evening after putting Isabella to bed and sitting alone in their small apartment. Surrounded by the sounds of little Havana settling into another night of life, continuing despite surrounding darkness. She thought about her own prayers during the worst days after Isabella's father disappeared, about the countless times she had wished for someone with resources and power to care about families like theirs, about Isabella's unusual gift and the responsibility that came with nurturing it rather than hiding from its implications. When Maria called Victor to tell him she was ready to support Isabella's plan, her voice carried the same determined strength that had sustained her through years of single motherhood and economic uncertainty. "If God gave my daughter this gift," Maria said, "then I have to trust that He also gave her the protection she needs to use it safely. And if helping you helps other families avoid losing their children, then we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, no matter how scary it feels." The foundation announcement was scheduled for the following Saturday at Bayfront Park, a public location in downtown Miami that would allow maximum media coverage while providing multiple escape routes if the situation became dangerous. Victor's security team worked around the clock to establish protection protocols while acknowledging that complete safety was impossible given the plan's inherent exposure. Law enforcement agencies were briefed on the situation and prepared to respond quickly, though they couldn't provide the kind of visible presence that might discourage the criminals from revealing themselves. As the day approached, Victor found his anxiety mixing with something he hadn't felt in years, excitement about possibility for positive change that extended far beyond his own healing. The foundation would help hundreds of families over the coming years, providing resources and support that could prevent other children from disappearing, other spouses from ending up in permanent comas, other homes from becoming museums of loss and regret. But more than the practical benefits of his charitable work, Victor was excited about the person he was becoming under Isabella's guidance. The bitter, isolated man who had lived like a ghost in his mansion was being replaced by someone who could imagine futures filled with purpose rather than just survival. Someone who could believe in miracles while working to create them through entirely human efforts, supported by divine inspiration. The night before the announcement, Isabella spent several hours in Victor's study, helping him practice the speech that would tell their story to the world. She listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that words carried power to heal or harm, to create light or deepen shadows, to invite angels into human situations or drive them away through faithlessness. "Remember," Isabella said as Victor finished his practice presentation, "you're not just telling people about sad things that happened. You're telling them about how love is stronger than sadness, how helping each other makes everyone stronger, and how angels are always working even when we can't see them. The people who hear your story will remember the hope parts, not just the hurt parts." As Victor tucked Isabella into Elena's former study, which had been converted into a bedroom for her increasingly frequent overnight visits, he realized that tomorrow would test everything he had learned about faith, courage, and the possibility of redemption through service to others. Either Isabella's angels would prove worthy of their trust, or they would all discover together what it meant to hope for miracles that didn't arrive when human hearts needed them most. But looking down at Isabella's peaceful face as she settled into sleep that seemed undisturbed by any anxiety about the approaching confrontation, Victor found his own fears being replaced by something he hadn't felt since childhood. The simple, powerful confidence that comes from believing the universe is fundamentally oriented toward good, and that sometimes the best way to fight darkness is to shine light so bright that shadows have nowhere left to hide. The morning of the foundation announcement dawned clear and warm, typical Miami winter weather that seemed designed to showcase the city's beauty to the hundreds of people gathering in Bayfront Park. Victor arrived early, accompanied by Isabella and Maria in an armored vehicle that drew curious looks from joggers and early commuters who had no idea they were witnessing a carefully orchestrated confrontation between forces of light and darkness. Isabella wore a simple white dress that Maria had sewn specially for the occasion, her amber eyes bright with anticipation rather than fear, as she surveyed the growing crowd of media representatives, city officials, and community leaders who had been invited to witness Victor's public transformation from reclusive billionaire to charitable advocate. She moved through the pre-event setup with the calm confidence of someone who had already seen how the day would unfold through dreams filled with angelic reassurance. Victor's security team maintained professional vigilance while acknowledging their limited ability to control a situation that deliberately exposed their primary asset to maximum vulnerability. They had identified multiple potential threats in the gathering crowd, suspicious individuals whose behavior patterns suggested hostile intentions, but Isabel had instructed Victor to proceed according to her angel's guidance rather than conventional security protocols. "The bad people are here," Isabella said quietly, standing beside Victor as he reviewed his speech one final time. "But so are the angels. The angels are much stronger. but they need us to be brave so they can work through our braveness to fix things. You don't have to be afraid. You just have to remember that love is bigger than hate, and truth is stronger than lies." When Victor stepped up to the podium at precisely noon, facing an audience of several hundred people with television cameras broadcasting his words throughout South Florida, he felt the kind of clarity that comes only from complete surrender to purposes larger than personal safety or comfort. His speech began with the prepared remarks about establishing a foundation to help crime victims, but quickly evolved into something more personal and profound, as Isabella's influence helped him speak from his heart rather than just his business-trained mind. Victor told the story of Elena's accident and Sophia's disappearance with a vulnerability that had never appeared in any of his previous public appearances. He described the 10 years of isolation and meaningless wealth accumulation that had followed, the gradual death of hope and faith that had turned his mansion into a monument to loss. But most importantly, he spoke about Isabella Rodriguez, the 9-year-old girl from Little Havana, who had somehow seen through his defenses to the wounded man beneath and helped him discover that healing was possible even for damage that seemed permanent. "This child," Victor said, gesturing toward Isabella, who stood quietly beside the podium, "taught me that angels are real, that miracles happen every day, and that the most powerful force in the universe isn't money or violence or fear. It's love expressed through ordinary people who choose to care about each other's welfare more than their own comfort." As Victor spoke, Isabella's presence seemed to amplify the impact of his words on the listening audience. Several people in the crowd were visibly moved to tears by his story, and the media representatives appeared genuinely engaged rather than just professionally interested. But more significantly, the suspicious individuals that security had identified were becoming visibly agitated, their carefully maintained cover beginning to slip as Victor's message of hope and healing created exactly the kind of spiritual light that Isabella had predicted would be unbearable for people whose hearts had been given over entirely to darkness. The confrontation came exactly as Isabella had foreseen, though not in the form anyone could have anticipated. As Victor concluded his speech and began taking questions from reporters, a man in the back of the crowd shouted accusations that Victor was exploiting a child's mental illness for publicity purposes, that his foundation was a fraud designed to launder money for criminal associates, and that people should investigate his real connections to the same criminal organization that had supposedly victimized his family. The accusations were clearly designed to discredit Victor's message and create doubt about his motives, but they had an effect opposite to what their speaker intended. Instead of generating suspicion toward Victor, they revealed the desperation of people who felt threatened by his public transformation from bitter victim to hopeful advocate. More importantly, they provided law enforcement officers with probable cause to detain and question individuals whose behavior had been suspicious but not previously actionable. Isabella stepped forward to the microphone with the natural authority she had always displayed when dealing with situations that required wisdom beyond her years. Her voice, amplified through the sound system, carried clearly across the park and created instant silence among an audience that recognized they were witnessing something unprecedented. "The man who just said those mean things," Isabella began, her young voice carrying absolute certainty, "is scared because he knows that when people start helping each other instead of hurting each other, there won't be any room left for the kind of badness he's been doing. But being scared doesn't give him the right to try to stop good things from happening. The angels want me to tell him that he still has time to choose love instead of anger, but not very much time, because love is getting stronger and anger is getting weaker every day." What followed was a confrontation that defied rational explanation, but provided unmistakable evidence of Isabella's extraordinary gift. The man who had made the accusations began experiencing what appeared to be severe emotional distress, crying uncontrollably while confessing to crimes that implicated multiple members of the criminal organization that had terrorized Victor's family. Other suspicious individuals in the crowd began fleeing or turning themselves into police, as if Isabella's words had triggered some kind of spiritual crisis that made continued deception impossible. Within hours, law enforcement had detained more than a dozen people with connections to the criminal network that had operated throughout South Florida for over a decade. The confessions and evidence gathered during the arrests led to additional raids and arrests that effectively dismantled an organization that had been considered untouchable by conventional law enforcement methods. The success was so complete and rapid that investigating officers privately acknowledged they had witnessed something that transcended normal police procedures. But the most profound miracle occurred not in the dramatic arrests or media coverage, but in the quiet transformation visible in Victor's face as he watched Isabella's angels work through her to bring light into places where darkness had seemed permanent. For the first time since Elena's accident, Victor felt the deep peace that comes from knowing his life had meaning, that extended beyond his own survival or comfort. He had become an instrument of healing for others, and in that service had found his own healing multiplied beyond anything he could have achieved through purely selfish pursuits. As the crowd dispersed and media crews packed their equipment, Isabella found herself surrounded by children who had been brought to the event by parents curious about the billionaire's unlikely young advisor. She spent the afternoon playing with kids whose families had been helped by similar foundations, telling stories about angels and miracles with the natural joy of someone sharing good news rather than supernatural claims. Watching Isabella interact with these children, Victor realized that his role in her mission was just beginning. The foundation would grow and help thousands of families over the coming years, but more importantly, Isabella's message about angels and love and the power of choosing hope over fear would spread through every life they touched together. He had been given the privilege of supporting her gift with resources that could amplify its reach, but the gift itself belonged to something much larger than either of them could understand or control. That evening, as they returned to Victor's mansion, which no longer felt like a prison, but rather like a headquarters for ongoing missions of mercy, Isabella made an observation that crystallized the transformation they had all witnessed. "The angels are very happy today," she said, settling into Elena's favorite chair in the garden where they had spent so many hours planning this unlikely victory. "They've been waiting for a long time for people to remember that love is supposed to win over hate, and goodness is supposed to be stronger than badness. Today they got to remind everyone how things are supposed to work when people are brave enough to trust them." Victor looked around his property, noting how different everything felt now that it was filled with purpose rather than just preserved in memory. The stopped clocks were ticking again, the sealed windows let in warm breezes that carried the scent of jasmine and possibility, and the silence had been replaced by the kind of peace that comes from knowing tomorrow would bring new opportunities to serve love rather than just survive another day of meaningless luxury. Isabella's angels had indeed proven worthy of their trust, but more importantly, they had proven that ordinary humans could become instruments of extraordinary healing when they chose faith over fear, service over selfishness, and hope over the kind of despair that had once threatened to consume Victor's entire existence. In the months that followed the foundation announcement, Victor's transformation from isolated billionaire to compassionate advocate became a model for what was possible when extraordinary wealth was guided by spiritual wisdom rather than purely material ambitions. Isabella continued her role as his advisor and conscience, helping him navigate the complex challenges of serving others while protecting his own continued healing from the wounds that would probably never completely disappear. The foundation grew rapidly, attracting support from unexpected sources as Victor's story inspired other wealthy individuals to consider how their own resources might serve purposes larger than personal accumulation. Within 6 months, they were helping over 200 families annually, providing not just financial assistance, but also the kind of comprehensive support that addressed emotional and spiritual needs alongside practical concerns. Isabella's role in the Foundation's work evolved naturally from supernatural consultant to practical teacher, helping everyone involved understand that miracles were most likely to occur when ordinary people committed themselves to extraordinary kindness. She established programs that brought together families who had suffered losses, creating communities of mutual support where healing could occur through shared experience rather than isolated struggle. Most remarkably, Isabella's influence began extending beyond the families directly served by the Foundation to the broader Miami community, where stories about the little girl who saw angels started inspiring others to look for divine presence in their own daily lives. Churches reported increased attendance, community gardens sprouted in neighborhoods that had been marked by violence and despair, and elementary schools began implementing conflict resolution programs based on Isabella's teachings about choosing love over anger. But the deepest transformation continued to occur within Victor himself, as weeks of working alongside Isabella gradually replaced his lingering cynicism with something approaching genuine faith. He began attending the small Catholic church where Isabella and Maria worshipped, finding comfort in rituals he had abandoned after Elena's accident. More significantly, he began visiting Elena at the medical facility where she remained unconscious, spending hours reading aloud to her and sharing stories about the work he and Isabella were doing together. During one of these hospital visits, approximately 8 months after Isabella had first entered his life, Victor experienced what he could only describe as direct communication from Elena's spirit, if not her conscious mind. As he sat beside her bed describing his latest Foundation project, Elena's eyes opened briefly, the first sign of consciousness she had shown in over 10 years. Her gaze met his with unmistakable recognition and what appeared to be approval, even pride, before she closed her eyes again and returned to her previous state. The medical staff could offer no explanation for this momentary awakening, just as they had no scientific basis for subtle improvements in Elena's vital signs that had been occurring since Victor began his regular visits. But Isabella, when Victor described the experience to her, simply smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose prayers had been answered exactly as expected. "She's been watching you become the man she always knew you could be," Isabella explained during one of their garden conversations. "Angels don't usually let people wake up from the sleep place unless there's something really important they need to see. She needed to see that you remembered how to love other people again, because that's what she was most worried about when she had to leave." Victor's healing accelerated after Elena's brief awakening, as if her approval had given him permission to embrace fully the new life Isabella had helped him discover. His nightmares about failing to protect his family were replaced by dreams in which Elena and Sophia appeared as guides, encouraging his Foundation work. The guilt that had consumed him for 10 years began transforming into gratitude for the opportunity to prevent other families from suffering similar losses. The Foundation's success attracted attention from law enforcement agencies throughout Florida, who began referring particularly difficult cases to Victor's team when conventional resources proved inadequate. His combination of unlimited financial resources and Isabella's supernatural insights proved uniquely effective at helping families navigate the complex aftermath of violent crimes, and several other states began developing similar programs based on their model. But Isabella's influence on Victor extended far beyond their professional collaboration into personal territory that touched the deepest corners of his emotional life. Under her guidance, he began the difficult process of converting Sophia's preserved bedroom into a space that could serve living children rather than just memorializing one who was lost. The transition required months of emotional preparation, but when it was finally complete, Sophia's room had become a cheerful guest space where families served by the Foundation could stay while receiving extended support services. The symbolic importance of this transformation was not lost on Victor, who recognized it as evidence that he had finally learned to honor his daughter's memory through service to other children rather than just protecting her material possessions from the passage of time. Isabella helped him understand that Sophia's spirit was more present in the laughter of living children than in the carefully preserved artifacts of her truncated life. As Isabella's 10th birthday approached, Victor found himself planning a celebration that would express his gratitude for everything she had given him, while acknowledging that their relationship was entering a new phase. Isabella was growing older and would soon need different kinds of support and guidance, but her fundamental gift for seeing angels and creating miracles showed no signs of diminishing with age. The birthday celebration, held in the Foundation's new community center that had been built on property adjacent to Victor's mansion, drew hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Isabella's ministry of hope. Children who had been served by Foundation programs, parents who had found healing through support groups, and community leaders who had witnessed the neighborhood transformation that radiated outward from Isabella's presence, all gathered to honor the little girl whose impossible wisdom had created ripple effects throughout South Florida. During the celebration, Victor announced his intention to establish an endowment that would ensure the Foundation's work could continue indefinitely, regardless of what happened to his personal fortune or involvement. But more significantly, he publicly acknowledged Isabella as the co-founder and spiritual director of an organization that had grown far beyond what either of them could have imagined when they first met on the steps of her apartment building. "This child," Victor told the assembled crowd, "taught me that angels are not mythological beings we read about in old books, but real forces of love and healing that work through ordinary people who choose extraordinary compassion. She taught me that wealth without purpose is poverty, that power without service is weakness, and that the most valuable treasures cannot be counted in any currency except the gratitude of hearts that have been healed." Isabella's response to Victor's tribute was characteristically humble and practical. Instead of basking in praise, she used the occasion to challenge everyone present to look for angels in their own daily lives and to become instruments through which divine love could reach people who needed healing but didn't know where to find it. "Angels are everywhere," Isabella told the crowd with the same matter-of-fact certainty she had always displayed when discussing supernatural reality. "But they can only help when people invite them by being kind to each other, especially to people who seem different or scary or sad. Every time you choose love instead of fear, you give angels more room to work. Every time you help someone who can't help you back, you become like an angel yourself." As the celebration wound down and guests began departing, Victor found himself standing with Isabella and Maria in the garden where so much of his healing had taken place. The space had been transformed from Elena's original design into something that served the Foundation's mission while honoring the memory of both women who had shaped Victor's understanding of love's power to transcend death and loss. "What happens now?" Victor asked, looking at Isabella with the mixture of affection and awe that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. "Where do the angels want us to go next?" Isabella's answer revealed the depth of her spiritual maturity and her growing understanding of her own role in God's larger plans for healing the world's wounds through human cooperation with divine love. "The angels want us to teach other people how to do what we've learned to do," she said with the calm authority that had always marked her most important pronouncements. "There are hurt people all over the world who need foundations like ours, and there are rich people all over the world who need to remember that money is supposed to help, not hurt. We're going to show them how angels work when people are brave enough to trust them." Victor realized that Isabella was describing not an ending but a beginning, not the conclusion of his transformation, but preparation for its expansion into service that could touch lives far beyond Miami. The foundation they had built together was indeed just the prototype for something much larger, a model that could be replicated wherever wealth and spiritual wisdom combined forces to create healing, rather than just accumulating more resources for their own sake. As they stood together in that garden filled with the scent of jasmine and the promise of continued growth, Victor understood that he had been given something infinitely more valuable than the return of his wife and daughter. He had been given a purpose that could honor their memory while serving the needs of countless other families who faced similar tragedies. Isabella's angels had indeed saved him, not by restoring what he had lost, but by showing him how loss could be transformed into gift, how wound could become source of healing, how one man's wealth could become instrument of divine love when guided by a child's pure heart. The stopped clocks in Victor's mansion had indeed started running again, but they were no longer measuring time lost in grief. They were measuring time invested in creating miracles, time devoted to proving that love really was stronger than hate, hope more powerful than despair, and angels more real than any force that sought to convince broken hearts that healing was impossible. 3 years had passed since Isabella first appeared in Victor Malone's carefully constructed world of isolation and grief. 3 years that had transformed not only his personal life, but the entire landscape of charitable work in South Florida. The foundation had grown into a nationally recognized model for comprehensive victim services, and Isabella's reputation as a child who possessed extraordinary spiritual gifts had attracted attention from universities, religious organizations, and media outlets throughout the country. But success had brought challenges neither Victor nor Isabella had fully anticipated. The attention focused on a young girl's supernatural abilities raised questions about exploitation. Despite the obvious sincerity of everyone involved and the Foundation's transparent financial practices that demonstrated no personal profit from Isabella's involvement. Child Protection Services had conducted multiple investigations, all concluding that Isabella was neither being harmed nor manipulated, but the scrutiny created stress for Maria, who worried constantly about bureaucratic interference with their work. More significantly, Isabella herself was beginning to show signs of the emotional weight that comes with carrying other people's pain on a daily basis. Her joy remained intact, and her connection to angelic guidance appeared as strong as ever. But Victor noticed moments of sadness in her eyes that spoke of someone who had seen too much suffering for someone her age. The balance between protecting Isabella's childhood and honoring her unique calling required constant attention and adjustment. On a warm Thursday evening in late spring, as Victor and Isabella sat in their favorite spot in Elena's garden reviewing applications from families seeking foundation assistance, Isabella made an announcement that changed everything once again. "The angels are telling me it's time for something new," she said, her voice carrying the thoughtful tone that usually preceded her most important revelations. "They're very happy about all the helping we've been doing, but they want me to start teaching other children how to see them too. There are lots of kids who have the same gift I have, but nobody believes them, so they think they're crazy or bad instead of special." Victor felt his heart constrict with an emotion he couldn't immediately identify. Pride mixed with loss, excitement tinged with fear. Isabella was describing the natural evolution of her ministry from personal healing work to something that could multiply her impact exponentially, but it also meant she would be moving beyond the intimate partnership that had defined both of their lives for the past 3 years. "What would that look like?" Victor asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "How would you teach other children? Where would they come from? How would we know they really have your gift?" Isabella's explanation revealed a vision that was both practical and miraculous, grounded in the same combination of spiritual wisdom and common sense that had characterized all her angels' guidance. She envisioned a residential program where children who displayed supernatural sensitivity could receive education and support while learning to use their gifts responsibly. The program would be funded by the Foundation, but administered by specialists in child development who understood how to nurture extraordinary abilities without exploiting them. "Angels pick children who need extra love and attention," Isabella continued, "because the gift only works right when it comes from a heart that knows how much God cares about people. But lots of these kids come from families that are already hurt or scared, so they don't get the love they need to keep the gift healthy. We could give them that love and teach them how to help other people the way I've been helping." The proposal represented everything Victor had learned about transforming personal healing into service for others, but applied on a scale that could affect hundreds or potentially thousands of children over the coming decades. It would require resources far beyond even his considerable wealth, institutional partnerships with government agencies and religious organizations, and most challengingly, trust that Isabella's angels really could be counted on to guide such an ambitious expansion of their work. But as Victor listened to Isabella describe her vision with the same calm certainty she had always displayed when channeling divine guidance, he realized that refusing to support this next phase would be like stopping a river in mid-flow. Isabella's gift had never belonged to him, had never been meant to serve only his healing or even their foundation's current work. It belonged to the world, and the world was ready for whatever miracle Isabella's angels wanted to create through her expanded ministry. "How do we begin?" Victor asked, surrendering once again to possibilities that transcended rational calculation. "What do we need to do first to make this happen?" Isabella's answer demonstrated the practical wisdom that had always complemented her spiritual gifts, the ability to translate angelic visions into achievable human action. They would start small, with a pilot program that could house and educate perhaps a dozen children while they developed curriculum and recruited staff. The program would be entirely voluntary for participating children and their families, with extensive safeguards to prevent any form of exploitation or abuse. Most importantly, Isabella insisted that she would remain available to support Victor's continued healing and the Foundation's ongoing work while beginning this new phase of her calling. She understood that her relationship with Victor had been foundational for both of them, and that ending it abruptly could damage the spiritual growth they had both achieved through their partnership. Over the following months, Victor threw himself into creating the infrastructure for Isabella's vision, with the same intensity he had once applied to building his business empire. He purchased a sprawling estate in the Coral Gables area that could be converted into a residential facility, hired architects and contractors to design spaces that would feel like home rather than institution, and began the complex process of obtaining legal authorization for a program unique in child welfare history. The regulatory challenges were immense, requiring negotiations with multiple government agencies that lacked precedent for evaluating programs based on supernatural gifts. But Victor's reputation and resources, combined with the Foundation's track record of success, eventually convinced officials that the proposed program deserved experimental approval under careful oversight. More difficult was the process of identifying children who possessed genuine spiritual sensitivity rather than simple imagination or attention-seeking behavior. Isabella worked with psychology professionals to develop screening procedures that could distinguish authentic gifts from trauma responses or developmental issues. But the evaluation process required her personal involvement in ways that limited how many children could be assessed. The first group of children selected for the program arrived at what became known as the Isabella Rodriguez Center for Spiritual Development on a sunny morning in September, 6 months after Isabella had announced the Angels' new directive. The children ranged in age from 8 to 14, came from backgrounds as diverse as Miami's multicultural population, and shared only their demonstrated ability to perceive spiritual reality in ways that conventional psychology couldn't explain. Watching Isabella interact with these children during their first week at the center, Victor witnessed something he had never seen before. Isabella in the company of peers who understood her gift from the inside rather than just observing its effects. Her joy was infectious as she shared techniques for communicating with angels, methods for distinguishing divine guidance from personal wishful thinking, and most importantly, strategies for using spiritual sensitivity to help others rather than just satisfying curiosity about supernatural phenomena. But the most profound transformation occurred in Victor himself as he observed Isabella beginning to fulfill her destiny as a teacher and guide for others who shared her extraordinary calling. He realized that his role in her life had been preparation for this moment, that everything they had accomplished together had been leading toward Isabella's emergence as a spiritual leader whose influence could extend far beyond their personal relationship. The recognition filled Victor with emotions he struggled to process: grief at losing the exclusive bond that had defined his healing, pride at witnessing Isabella's growth into her full purpose, and gratitude for having been chosen as the instrument through which her gift could find its proper expression. He had been privileged to serve as Isabella's protector and supporter during the early development of her ministry, but now she was ready for responsibilities that required different kinds of assistance than he could provide. 6 months after the center opened, Victor made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He announced his intention to step back from day-to-day operations of both the foundation and the center, transitioning into an advisory role that would allow him to support both programs while pursuing his own continued spiritual development under Isabella's guidance. "I've spent the last 4 years learning how to live again," Victor explained during a board meeting where he announced his transition plans. "Isabella taught me that wealth and power are only valuable when they serve love, but she also taught me that true healing requires ongoing spiritual discipline that I can't maintain while managing complex organizations. It's time for me to become a student rather than always being the benefactor." The decision reflected Victor's growing understanding that his transformation was not complete simply because he had learned to use his resources for charitable purposes. Isabella's angels were calling him toward even deeper levels of spiritual maturity that would require letting go of control and identity based on worldly success, even success in service of others. Isabella's response to Victor's announcement revealed her own spiritual growth over their 4 years together. Instead of the childlike acceptance she might have displayed earlier, she offered the kind of wise counsel that acknowledged both the difficulty and necessity of his decision. "Angels don't always ask people to give up things that make them feel important," Isabella said during one of their final private counseling sessions. "But sometimes they do, because holding on to anything too tight can keep your heart from growing bigger. Your angels have been waiting for you to trust them enough to let go of being the person who fixes everything, so you can become the person who helps God fix things through being willing to be fixed yourself." Victor's transition from organizational leader to spiritual student was neither quick nor easy. Learning to accept guidance rather than always providing it challenged every instinct developed during decades of business success. But under Isabella's patient mentoring, he began discovering forms of peace and fulfillment that transcended any satisfaction he had derived from professional achievement or charitable recognition. The foundation and center continued thriving under new leadership, with Victor maintaining supportive involvement while focusing primarily on his own spiritual development and the personal relationships that Isabella had taught him to value above all material accomplishments. He renewed connections with extended family members he had neglected during his years of isolation, developed friendships with other foundation donors who shared his commitment to serving purposes larger than personal comfort, and most importantly, continued his regular visits to Elena's bedside with acceptance rather than desperate hope for impossible restoration. On the 5th anniversary of his first meeting with Isabella, Victor found himself standing in the same spot where she had first spoken to him about angels who guard the broken. But instead of the bitter, isolated man who had dismissed a child's wisdom 5 years earlier, he had become someone capable of seeing angels himself, not as supernatural apparitions, but as the divine love that worked through ordinary people who chose extraordinary compassion. Isabella, now 14 and beginning to transition toward adult responsibilities while maintaining her childlike faith, joined Victor in that meaningful location for a celebration that honored both their individual transformations and their continued partnership in service to healing. "Do you remember what you told me that first day?" Victor asked, looking at the young woman who had somehow remained pure despite witnessing years of human suffering and spiritual struggle. "You said that power wears a blindfold sometimes, and that the smallest light can show the way home. I was so angry then, so sure that nothing good could come from trusting in anything I couldn't control or purchase." Isabella's response reflected the mature wisdom of someone who had spent years learning to balance spiritual gifts with human responsibilities, supernatural insight with practical compassion. "The angels never give up on people," she said with the same calm certainty that had characterized her most important communications from the beginning. "They just wait until people get tired enough of being angry to try being grateful instead. You got tired faster than most people do, probably because you had enough money to discover that money doesn't fix the important broken things." As they talked in that place where their miraculous friendship had begun, Victor realized that his story was not ending, but entering its most meaningful chapter. Isabella's angels had indeed saved him, not by restoring his original life, but by helping him discover purposes more fulfilling than anything he could have imagined during his years of isolation and grief. The foundation continued serving hundreds of families annually. The center was preparing its first graduating class of young people trained to use spiritual gifts in service of others. And Victor himself had become living proof that the most profound transformations often came through surrendering control rather than accumulating more power to impose solutions on problems too complex for purely human resolution. Standing with Isabella in the warm Miami afternoon, watching children play in parks where violence had once made families afraid to gather, Victor understood that he had been given the rarest of gifts, the opportunity to witness and participate in authentic miracles created through the collaboration between human love and divine grace, that Isabella had always insisted was available to anyone brave enough to trust angels they couldn't see but could certainly learn to recognize through their effects on the world. 10 years had passed since Isabella Rodriguez first looked into Victor Malone's eyes and told him she could see angels who guard the broken. A decade of transformation that began with one man's desperate need for healing had grown into something neither of them could have imagined, a network of programs serving families throughout the southeastern United States, a residential center that had graduated over 200 young people trained to use spiritual gifts for community healing, and a model for wealth-based philanthropy that prioritized spiritual development alongside material assistance. Victor, now in his mid-60s, had aged gracefully under Isabella's influence, his hair silver, but his eyes bright with the kind of peace that comes from knowing one's life serves purposes larger than personal comfort or recognition. The bitter edge that had once marked his every interaction had been replaced by gentle authority that drew people seeking guidance rather than intimidating them into submission. He had become exactly what Isabella's angels had envisioned, a wealthy man whose resources served love rather than power, whose influence created healing rather than dependency. Isabella herself, now 24, had grown into a young woman whose spiritual gifts had matured rather than diminished with age. Her work with the center had expanded into consultation with similar programs in 12 different states, and her insights into practical applications of supernatural wisdom had attracted attention from universities studying the intersection of psychology and spirituality. But despite opportunities for fame and financial benefit, Isabella had remained committed to the principles that had guided her childhood, serving others rather than promoting herself, living simply despite abundant resources, and maintaining the humility that kept her gifts connected to divine source rather than personal ambition. Maria Rodriguez had used her daughter's success as opportunity for her own education and development, earning degrees in social work and nonprofit management that qualified her to serve as executive director of the foundation that had grown from Victor's initial gratitude into Isabella's primary mission. Her transformation from single mother, struggling to pay rent, into respected leader in victim advocacy demonstrated that Isabella's angels were interested in healing entire families and communities, not just individual wounds. On a warm Thursday evening in March, as Victor sat in Elena's garden reviewing latest reports from foundation programs, he received a phone call that would test everything he had learned about faith and healing over the past decade. Elena's medical team was calling to inform him that his wife had awakened from her coma, not temporarily, as she had done several times over the years, but with clear consciousness and apparent full memory of their life together before the accident. Victor's immediate reaction was joy so intense it felt dangerous, as if his heart might not be able to process such overwhelming happiness after years of accepting Elena's absence as permanent condition. But alongside celebration came fear. Fear that Elena might not recognize the man he had become, might not understand the spiritual transformation that had redefined every aspect of his existence, might not approve of the intimate friendship with Isabella that had been central to his healing. When Victor arrived at the medical facility accompanied by Isabella and Maria, he found Elena sitting up in bed, looking remarkably healthy, despite having been unconscious for over 15 years. Her hair was silver now, and her face showed signs of aging, but her eyes held the same warmth and intelligence that had first attracted Victor when they were both young professionals building careers and dreaming of family. Elena's first words when she saw Victor revealed that whatever had sustained her consciousness during the long coma had allowed her to observe his transformation rather than remaining completely absent from his life. "I know you," she said softly, reaching for his hand with fingers that trembled from disuse but gripped with unmistakable love. "You're the man I always hoped you would become, but never expected to see during our earthly life together." The reunion that followed was extraordinary in ways that medical staff could not explain, and Isabella described simply as another example of how angels worked when love needed to accomplish something impossible through entirely natural means. Elena's recovery proceeded rapidly, her physical therapy advancing faster than anyone predicted, her memory returning in complete detail rather than fragments, her adjustment to current circumstances showing none of the confusion or distress that typically marked similar cases. But most remarkably, Elena seemed to possess complete understanding of Victor's relationship with Isabella and the foundation work that had defined his life since her accident. She spoke about their activities with knowledge that suggested she had been spiritually present for significant events, observing and approving Victor's transformation while waiting for appropriate time to resume active participation in his healing journey. "I dreamed about you constantly," Elena told Isabella during their first private conversation, "though I suppose they weren't really dreams if I was unconscious. I saw how you helped Victor remember that love doesn't end when people die or get hurt. It just changes form and finds new ways to work through people who are willing to let it use them. I've been waiting 15 years to thank you for giving my husband back his heart." Isabella's response demonstrated the spiritual maturity that had developed over years of serving as bridge between earthly concerns and divine purposes. "Angels always keep families connected, even when it looks like they've been separated forever," she said with the gentle authority that had characterized her most important spiritual observations. "You were never really gone. You were just working from a different place, helping Victor learn lessons he needed to know before you could be together again in the way that would make both of you happy." Elena's return to conscious life created challenges neither Victor nor Isabella had anticipated, but also opportunities for their relationship to evolve into something more complex and ultimately more fulfilling than either had previously experienced. Elena joined their spiritual consultations, bringing perspectives that had been gained through years of existing in whatever realm spirits inhabit when physical bodies can no longer contain them. Her insights into the nature of consciousness and healing added new dimensions to Isabella's growing understanding of how divine love manifested through human cooperation with angelic guidance. But Elena's awakening also meant Victor had to navigate the delicate process of integrating his wife back into a life that had been transformed by another relationship that was spiritual rather than romantic, but deeper than conventional friendship. Isabella provided crucial guidance during this adjustment period, helping both Victor and Elena understand that love was abundant rather than limited, that multiple relationships could serve different spiritual purposes without competing or threatening each other. "The angels showed me that Victor needed to learn how to love without fear before he could love me the way I needed to be loved," Elena explained to Maria during one of their conversations about the complex dynamics Isabella had helped create. I couldn't teach him that lesson because I was part of what he was afraid of losing. Isabella could teach him because she represented pure gift, love offered without conditions or expectations, service provided without hope of personal benefit. Now that he knows how to love that way, we can have the marriage we were meant to have but never quite achieved because we were both too afraid of loss to risk complete trust. 6 months after Elena's awakening, Victor made an announcement that surprised everyone except Isabella, who had been expecting it since the day they first met. He was establishing an endowment that would fully fund both the foundation and the center in perpetuity, then retiring from all administrative responsibilities to focus on his marriage and his own continued spiritual development. The decision represented the final stage of Victor's transformation, from man whose identity depended on controlling outcomes to someone whose happiness came from trusting divine purposes he could serve but not direct. Elena supported his decision enthusiastically, recognizing it as evidence that Victor had finally learned to distinguish between authentic responsibility and the kind of compulsive controlling that prevents divine love from working through human relationships. Isabella accepted Victor's transition with the same graceful wisdom she had always displayed during significant changes. She understood that their intensive spiritual mentoring relationship had served its primary purpose and was naturally evolving into something more like normal friendship between two people who would always be connected by shared experience of miraculous healing, but no longer needed the intensive interaction that had characterized Victor's initial recovery. Angels bring people together for exactly as long as they need to be together in particular ways, Isabella observed during their final formal counseling session. Our angels brought us together because you needed to learn that love is stronger than loss, and I needed to learn that gifts are meant to be shared with the world, not just with one person. Now, we both know those things, so the angels can use us for other purposes while we keep being grateful for what we learned from each other. On the 10th anniversary of their first meeting, Victor and Isabella returned to the corner in Little Havana where she had first spoken to him about angels who guard the broken. But this time, they were accompanied by Elena, Maria, 12 graduates of the Centers program who had established similar centers in other cities, and over 50 families who had been served by programs that grew from Victor's initial desperate need for Isabella's impossible gift. The gathering was both celebration and commitment ceremony, marking not the end of their story but its evolution into something larger than either Victor or Isabella could create individually. They were no longer the wounded billionaire and the mystical child whose unlikely friendship had created healing for both of them, but rather co-founders of a movement that demonstrated how human cooperation with divine love could create miracles on scales that affected entire communities. Victor's speech during the anniversary celebration reflected the wisdom that had grown from years of learning to serve purposes larger than personal healing. Even healing as profound as what Isabella had facilitated in his own life. 10 years ago, Victor said, I was a man who had everything money could buy and nothing that made life worth living. I was bitter, isolated, and convinced that the universe was fundamentally hostile toward anyone who dared to love someone they might lose. Isabella taught me that angels are real, but more importantly, she taught me that angels work through ordinary people who choose extraordinary compassion. She transformed my wealth from meaningless accumulation into purposeful service, my isolation into connection, my bitterness into gratitude for opportunities to prevent others from suffering what nearly destroyed me. Isabella's response focused not on what they had accomplished together, but on the expanding circle of people who had learned to recognize angels in their own lives and become instruments through which divine love could reach others who needed healing, but didn't know where to find it. Angels are everywhere, Isabella said with the same matter-of-fact certainty she had displayed since childhood. But they need people who are brave enough to trust love more than they fear getting hurt. Victor taught me that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is believing in their gift even when they've forgotten they have one. Everyone has something special they can use to help other people, But sometimes it takes someone else's faith to help them remember what that special thing is. As the celebration concluded and participants began departing for their various homes and missions, Victor found himself standing with Isabella and Elena in the garden that had hosted so many crucial conversations during his transformation. The space looked different now, brighter, more alive, filled with flowers that attracted butterflies and birds whose songs provided soundtrack for ongoing healing rather than monument to interrupted life. Looking at these two women who had shaped his understanding of love's power to transcend loss and create meaning from suffering, Victor realized his story had become something he never could have imagined when Isabella first appeared in his carefully constructed world of isolation and grief. He had been saved, but not in the way he had originally hoped. Instead of getting back what he had lost, he had discovered purposes more fulfilling than anything he had ever possessed or achieved. Elena squeezed his hand with fingers that had regained strength through miracle he still couldn't fully comprehend, but no longer needed to question. Isabella smiled with the serene satisfaction of someone whose life work was bearing fruit beyond initial expectations. And Victor felt the deep peace that comes from knowing one's existence serves love in ways that create blessing for countless others while providing personal fulfillment that transcends any happiness based on individual circumstances or achievements. The angels Isabella saw had indeed been real, had indeed been working to heal wounds that seemed beyond human remedy. But they had accomplished their healing not through supernatural intervention that bypassed natural processes, but through inspiring human hearts to choose cooperation with divine love over isolation in private pain. Victor had learned to see angels too, not as mystical beings, but as the sacred presence that worked through every act of genuine compassion, every choice to trust hope rather than surrender to despair. Every decision to use personal resources for others' welfare, rather than just protecting oneself from life's inevitable losses. Standing in that garden with evening light painting the sky in shades of gold and coral, Victor understood that his transformation was complete, not because his wounds had disappeared, but because they had been transformed into sources of healing for others. Isabella's angels had saved him by showing him how to become an angel himself, not perfect or supernatural, but willing to let love work through his life in ways that created miracles for people who needed them as desperately as he once had. The stopped clocks throughout his mansion had long since resumed their steady rhythm, measuring time devoted to service rather than imprisonment in loss. And in that gentle passage of moments dedicated to purposes larger than personal comfort, Victor had found the kind of immortality that comes not from avoiding death, but from choosing love so consistently that its effects continue blessing others long after individual stories end. He had indeed found his way home at last, not to what he had lost, but to what he was meant to become. And you, have you ever met someone small who changed your life in an immense way? Have you ever discovered that your deepest wound could become your greatest source of healing for others? In your own moments of loss and isolation, have you wondered if angels might be real, not as supernatural beings, but as the divine love that works through ordinary people who choose extraordinary compassion? Perhaps this story has reminded you that purpose can emerge from pain, that wealth finds its truest value in service, and that sometimes the most profound transformations come not from getting back what we've lost, but from learning to see the gifts that loss can reveal when we're brave enough to let our wounds become bridges to others who are walking similar paths. Tell me your story in the comments below. Share a moment when someone unexpected became your angel, when loss led to discovery of purpose you never could have imagined. If this story has touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so this message can reach other souls who also need to believe again that healing is possible, that angels are real, and that love truly is stronger than anything that seeks to convince us otherwise. Because in a world that often feels broken and dark, we need every reminder we can find that light exists, that healing happens, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most powerful messages about what it means to live with hope instead of fear, with purpose instead of mere survival, with faith instead of cynical resignation to the idea that nothing truly beautiful can last.